few months ago, we went to the Pot Still, which is one of the best whiskey bars in the world.
Come with me, and you'll be in a world of pure imagination.
They were doing a 35-year-old blend that they put together to celebrate being family-owned for 35 years.
You know what I like best?
What's that?
The price.
So we bought a bottle. Well, I bought a bottle and Ed bought a bottle. And then we came back the next day and we got 2 more bottles each. So between us, we have 6 bottles, which is saying something because there are only 70 bottles actually made, and we have 6 of them. When I say it out loud, it kind of sounds a bit sad. I'm not sure if this makes us really cool or a bit pathetic.
As if.
I'm going to go with cool. The thing is, it's such a nice whiskey, and we knew that without even trying it. The reason we knew it would be so good was because we know how to read the label, and we thought we'd do this video to talk about how to read a whiskey label. The first thing that you're going to notice on a whiskey label is the brand. The brand is usually the same as the distillery, so for most Scotch whiskies, this is really straightforward. Glenfiddich comes from the Glenfiddich distillery. Simple. It gets a bit more complicated when you're looking at something like Arran, but it's still pretty straightforward. Arran, the Arran distillery, makes the Arran malt, so that's easy enough. When you start looking at the American bourbons though, it gets a bit more confusing. Buffalo Trace is made by the Buffalo Trace distillery. Straightforward, that's really similar to what you'd see in Scotland. But Buffalo Trace distillery also makes Blanton's, Eagle Rare, Pappy Van Winkle Family Reserve, and loads of other brands. So that can be a bit more confusing, and so you've got to look for that on the label. The real exceptions come from boutique bottlers and blenders. That is getting really interesting because the person that's actually making the whiskey isn't the same person that's putting it in the bottle, or they might be different than the label that's actually going on it. So let's look at that pot still I was talking about before. So the pot still is obviously not a distillery. It's not even a brand of whiskey. It's been made by the Creative Whiskey Company, who are a bottler. So they've bought several casks from lots of different distilleries, and they've put those all together into that bottle. So on the label, you're not going to see the name of any specific distillery. All you're going to see is the Creative Whiskey Company. And so you know when you see that, that means that they're a bottler who's put this together using lots of different distilleries to create that flavor. When it says it's been aged for 35 years, that means it's spent at least 35 years in a whiskey barrel. But you might have older whiskey that's included in that. The key is that on the label, the youngest whiskey is what gets printed. If I'm a blender, I might say, this whiskey's good, but it needs more complexity. So I might decide I'm going to add some older whiskey, and that's fine. But it means that when I put it on the whiskey label, I have to put the youngest. So let's say I've got a great 20-year-old whiskey, and I think, you know what, I'm just going to add a teaspoon of 5-year-old whiskey. I could do that, but that means when I print the label, I can't call it a 20-year-old whiskey, I have to call it a 5-year-old, because it has a teaspoon of 5-year-old whiskey in it, which would probably be a bad career move. Age matters, and it's all about the youngest age on the whiskey. Now we're seeing a lot of non-age statement whiskey. Now look on this label. You're not going to see an age statement anywhere. We're starting to see a lot of these non-age statements or NAS whiskeys. A lot of them compensate for not having an age statement by having a really cool name. And you have to admit, Blood Oak is a really cool name. But if the bottle doesn't say how old it is, chances are the age isn't impressive. The next thing to look for is wood type. So from this label, we can see that it's a mixture of French red wine casks and ex-bourbon casks. This is becoming increasingly common. You used to only see one wood type, sherry, bourbon, that was usually it. But now we're seeing sort of mixes of these, and it makes for some really interesting complex flavors. Then you get something called finishing. Finishing, which is something that Aaron does very well, is taking a whiskey that's done in one type of cask, so usually ex-bourbon, and then putting it in a few years in something that's different, usually a bit more interesting. So this has been finished in Amarone casks. It doesn't have an age statement, but my guess is that this is probably about 5 years in an ex-bourbon, and then finished for maybe 2 years in Amarone.
I'm finished.
The next thing you'll see on your label is ABV, alcohol by volume. Alcohol by volume is always expressed as a percentage, and it's the percentage of ethanol in that whiskey at 20 degrees Celsius. So here we have an ABV of 47.2%. That means that 47.2% of the liquid in this bottle is ethanol, and by default, 52.8% is water. Alcohol strength in the US is measured by proof, so you might not see ABV, but you'll see proof, which is just twice ABV. So that 47.2% ABV, if it were in the US, would be 94.4% proof.
Yeah, I like math.
Ew, why?
Also, if it were American, the bottle would be bigger.
You see, this is where Gene and I always get into a heated debate. I like them when they're really big.
And I think it's better when they're enormous.
In the US, the standard bottle is 750 milliliters, or 75 centiliters. And you'll always see that printed on the label. In the UK, you'll also see the size printed on the label, but the bottle is smaller. So you'll see 700 milliliters or 70 centiliters printed on the bottle. The reason the bottle is smaller in the UK is because of an EU directive which was passed in 1992, specifically targeted at British tourists who they wanted to annoy. If you're drinking a cask strength whiskey, that means that it's come directly from the barrel and been put into the bottle. It's going to have a higher ABV, and somewhere on the label you'll see cask strength, because that's a unique selling point. A lot of the times with cask strength whiskey, you'll also see a specific cask that whiskey has come from. When you're drinking a lot of high-end whiskey, you'll usually find the words non-chill filtered somewhere on the label.
All right, everyone, chill.
When you add water or ice to whiskey, the whiskey naturally goes cloudy. This cloudiness can bother some people, so before bottling, the distilleries chill the whiskey down and filter out the elements that cause cloudiness. Non-chill filtered has become a mark of quality because it means that the whiskey hasn't been tampered with, hasn't been changed. It doesn't necessarily change the flavor, but if something says non-chill filtered, they're trying to give you a message that this is a high-end boutique whiskey. If it doesn't say non-chill filtered, chances are it's been chill filtered. Along with non-chill filtering, a lot of the times in higher-end whiskeys, you'll see no artificial color. E150A is spirit caramel, and it's often added to mass-produced whiskeys to ensure consistent coloring.
How dark do you want to be? We have 1, 2, or 3.
Well, I like how you look. What are you?
Puerto Rican.
2.
Adding the words natural color to the whiskey label is a way for the distributor or the producer to give you a mark of quality. And that's what they're doing with that or non-chill filtered. Chances are, if it doesn't say natural coloring, there's probably E150A added to it. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but you can guess that from reading the whiskey label. Hopefully in this video we've given you some good tips and hints about how to understand what messages the distributor is trying to tell you on a whiskey label. If you found it useful, or if there are things that we've missed, leave us a comment down below. And remember to subscribe to our channel. We post a new whiskey video every Wednesday.